So divine command theory is the next subjectivist sort of idea we're going to be looking at, and Humer doesn't really give us much to work with on this theory, mostly because he just doesn't find it very compelling. It's a very controversial theory because it says that the moral facts depend for their truth or falsity on the commands of a being that not everybody agrees exists, right? God. And You can sort of cast this out as an absolutist or a relativist theory, depending on whether you think that the commands can change relative to time, right? So then the truth value of the sentences can change, and then you get a relativist theory. If they're absolute commands, then it's an absolutist theory. But in any case, that doesn't really matter too much to the objections, and the most nice way of cashing it out, I think, is in terms of sentences like this, right? S should do X gets translated on this theory into God commands S to do X, right? And then S should do not X, or rather X should not do X, means God commands that S do not X, or rather that S not X. And so is this a plausible analysis of this phrase up here? Well, Humer mainly just thinks that no, because it's very difficult to know what it is that God commands, right? There are many religious texts. They all seem to contradict each other, so it's very unclear whether God commands a certain thing. You might fire back at that by saying, I have a justified belief in Islam, so I have evidence for Islam, so I'm rationally justified in saying that God commands me to do certain things in this book, the Quran, which contains commands, a list of commands that God says for me to do. But then you face the problem of addressing what happens when you run into a moral obligation that you're not sure is in the list of commands, right? So, for example, you might say that you're having troubles with whether you're morally obligated to join PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. It's a company that specializes on animal rights activism. That's not really in the Quran. The Quran doesn't really address whether you should be a member of PETA. It doesn't really know that PETA exists, right? So it's not going to be covered in the command list. And so you might infer whether God would command you to join PETA or command you to not join PETA or just be neutral on the subject of joining PETA by determining whether or not God's going to intuit that, or rather, by determining whether or not God would have a reason for you to not join PETA or join PETA or be neutral about it. The way to sort of determine that is to look at God's previous commands and make inferences about his psychology or his personality that would result in a conclusion about whether he would command you to do this or that. And you might gain extra support for that by saying, I have a relationship with God. I talk to this guy. He has a personality, so I understand his reasons for doing things. And so I understand his motivations, so I understand what he would command me to do, and whether he would command me to join PETA. There is a certain group of people called the skeptical theists who don't think that this is possible. They don't think it's possible for you to have knowledge about God's motivations, his internal reasons for doing things that would allow you to infer new commands that he would give you, right? They think that's asking for too much. And the reason for that is God gives very strange commands, or rather, God gives commands that aren't obvious to you to piece together, right? It's clear throughout at least the Christian Bible, right, that many of God's commands don't seem to cohere together. One day he tells you to not kill people. The other day he tells you to go into a city, pillage it, and kill everyone, right? So the plan that God has for humanity here might be a good one, but the way in which it's good is very complicated, and you can't really interpret it in terms of just looking at his commands. He's an infinitely smart being, so you can't just figure it out on your own by just thinking. And so this is the motivation the skeptical theists have for saying, you can't really know God's motivations for doing stuff. But you might be a divine command theorist and a skeptical theist, and you might say, I think that we should be moral skeptics too. We should be skeptical that we know that we should do certain things. Why do we expect to know whether we should join PETA or not join PETA? Maybe that's just not a settled issue. You can't figure it out. It's difficult. In that case, you wouldn't have a problem with this sort of argument. Humer doesn't like moral skepticism, probably because he's an epistemologist. He makes theories about knowing things, and he doesn't really think that that kind of skepticism is plausible, right? So there's another objection that you might consider to divine command theory in terms of just attacking whether this is a real, genuine equivalence, right? And there's many ways you could do that. One of the ways you could do that is you could say, there are some things that God can command, right? Or rather, there are some things that God can't command, right? There are some X's that God can't issue as commands that nevertheless are moral obligations, right? So let's say, for example, let's say hypothetically, that there's a number n, a very large number, an inconceivably large number, with finitely many digits, right? So an example of this kind of number would be the square root of 2. You can't picture all of the digits in the square root of 2 in your head. It's biologically impossible. You don't have the brain power to do that. You can try and see how many digits you get up to, but there will be many digits that you can't get up to. And so God might command you to count up to this number, right? And given an infinite amount of time, you should be able to count up to this number, right? So let's say God commands you to do this. I command you to count to the number n in heaven, right? And n here is just this large, finite number. And so you have an infinite amount of time to do it, so you should be able to count up to that number. But you might ask whether it's possible for God to issue this command to you, right? Since you don't have an infinite amount of brain processing power, it seems like this command can't be issued to you. Why? Well, because you don't really know what the number n is. If God tried to write out the number n and write that into your brain as you were processing the full command, you wouldn't be able to think about it. Your brain would crash. It would be like a computer crash. It would blue screen. There would be nothing. You would lose the ability to process thought. Or rather, you wouldn't have enough capacity to process that thought. And so it seems like this isn't a thing that God could command, could instruct you to do. Right? It's not something that you could understand the satisfaction conditions of. If you tried to imagine what it would be like to do this successfully and to say to yourself, I've finished the task that you asked me to do, you wouldn't be able to imagine that. You wouldn't imagine what it was like to finish counting to the number whose digits you can't even represent in your head, right? You can't picture that number in your head. So this seems like a command that God can't give you. And there are various ways of formulating this that I've thought of. This one you might not be able to read clearly, but it says, I command you to deliver an envelope which contains a piece of paper with N written on it, right? So this is to alleviate worries maybe about counting to the relevant number. God just has to make a piece of paper that's big enough to contain the number, and then just has to put it in an envelope, and you just have to deliver it. But he has to tell you to deliver it, and so you get the same problem. You might try to solve this with coextension, right? So you might try to come up with different names for n, or just n, right? You might say, God could tell me this, and as long as n refers to the number, it's a command, right? Even if I don't know what n is, that's fine, as long as n refers to the relevant number. I don't think that's a very convincing objection, right? If God commands you to do something, you have to have a picture in your head about what he's commanding you to do, right? So you have to be able to represent that number in some way. You can call it n, but in your head you have to know what he's talking about. And that's too many digits for you to know what he's talking about. And there are various other ways you can come up with objections to God's commanding abilities, reflecting whether you should do something or not. And you can go the other way too, right? You can say there are certain things that you should do that God can't command you to do, that are impossible for God to command you to do. And finding flukes and loopholes around that might be sort of a fun exercise for you if you're interested in moral semantics. But as far as DCT itself goes, it seems like that's about all we're going to discuss about it, because there's not a lot of material on it in the readings. But yeah, that's divine command theory.